My name is Michael Carr, and this is How to Hook an Agent. Today we're going to discuss 7 techniques for managing tension in your book. Now, if you're new to this channel, you might go ahead and consider subscribing. You can get my tips and insights about agenting and the publishing world in general. One problem that I notice in a lot of fiction from aspiring writers is the story will start off strong and then the whole thing kind of falls apart and things get a little bit boring. The writer gets out down in the weeds and forgets the whole point of storytelling in the first place, and that is to get the reader to turn pages. And if you're reading through your manuscript, you've got maybe a first draft or a second draft, and you're noticing that it flags a little bit and that interest is dying off in certain areas. Maybe you're getting some feedback from your beta readers, or they're getting to a point maybe 50 or 100 pages in, maybe 5 pages in, where they find themselves putting the book down and are having a hard time picking it up again. It may be that some of these techniques could help you in getting over what is essentially a fairly common problem in not only aspiring writers' fiction, but sometimes in published novels too. If you ever find yourself reading avidly a book and then suddenly putting it down, there's a really good chance that it's because tension is diffused and you're having a hard time finding that you care what comes next. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And the first thing I want to discuss is to resist the urge to explain. Withholding the juicy information. This is a problem that sometimes happens right from the get-go in a new manuscript. I'll read a great hook or a great opening line that intrigues me. I've already read the query and it's got a great, interesting idea. And then what does the author do? Immediately stops the story to give me all of the background on everything, feeling like I need to be caught up to speed with how the story got to this point, right? They know they need to start in the middle of things, and so they start in the middle of things, and then they slow down and back up and tell me everything that got me to this point. So if you think about this from storytelling in your day-to-day life, you'll realize why this is kind of problematic. For example, here's a scenario. You're a teenager, you've gone out with your mother's car and something has happened to the car while you were out on, say, a date or with your friends, and you come back and you need to tell your mother about this incident with the car. There's 2 ways to do it. First of all, if you want to get it out of the way and alleviate her concern and diffuse the tension as much as possible, you're going to rush through the details and tell right up front how bad it was or how bad it wasn't. I was out tonight and there was a little bit of an incident with the car, but don't worry, it's just a scratch and it wasn't our fault, and you're going to rush through that. If you, on the other hand, want to wind your mother up and maximize the amount of stress she's going to feel, you're going to withhold the details of what happened, right? You're going to say something like, so kind of a funny thing happened while I was out with the car. I hope you're not upset about this. I don't think it was my fault, but yeah, it's not really good, right? And she doesn't know if there's like a scratch in the paint or if the car is completely undrivable. And that, of course, is the point of why you would tell the story like that if you're going to be cruel to your mother. So there's 2 ways to tell the story. One is to withhold the details. And I'm not talking about failure to be clear or a lack of clarity. I'm talking about the sort of thing where you're introducing an idea or a mystery. It's clear what's happened, but we don't know why it's happened. We don't know what the setup is for. This is a really common mistake in science fiction and fantasy, where someone starts off with a little bit of a problem, and the writer immediately wants to go back and fill in all the details of the history of this fantasy world or what this science fiction premise is like. It's really important to remember that it isn't the finding out that drives the reader interest, it's the lack of knowing. It's the uncertainty. It's the doubts that are created in their mind as to what's going to happen. Whatever clever idea or concept you come up with in science fiction or fantasy, for example, there is no explanation that is going to be as exciting as the range of possibilities of what this mystery is. And a reader, whether he or she really feels that they want to know what's happening, really loves not knowing. That's what gets them turning the pages, is to try to find out the answers to these sort of questions. And as you explain the background of your story and as you give them more detail, you have a chance to then deepen other aspects, to deepen the character, to deepen the understanding of the world, to create new conflicts and new problems. And by the time you get the answer to that initial question, then there will be other things to hook them. Always leave the reader with a little bit of doubt as to what's going to happen, a little bit of doubt as to why certain things are happening, and withhold that information as long as possible. Number 2, consider introducing some dramatic irony into your story. What do I mean by dramatic irony? That is something that the reader knows, but the character doesn't. A perfect example would be a young Jewish woman in Berlin in 1932, just starting her college experience, right? She knows about this Nazi movement. She's aware of the hatred towards Jews by some people in German society, but she has no idea as to what's going to happen in the subsequent 12 or 13 years. If we know as a reader that this is going to be a story that's going to play out over years, even just merely the fact that there's a Jewish character in Berlin in the early 1930s, we know she's going to be impacted. That's dramatic irony. We know something the reader does, or the characters in the story don't know yet. Another example would be when you have multiple points of view and you have one character who's going to do something and he has incomplete information. We've been in the head of another character in a different chapter, and we know that that character is doing something that is going to cause conflict for the other characters a little oblivious. Romantic comedies rely on this trope all the time, where one character thinks another character is doing something. We know that it's wrong. They're getting offended. They break up due to mutual misunderstanding. And because we've had the chance to see both of their points of view, it drives the tension. Obviously, it could be used a little bit too much, and it's going to be used more in some genres than others. If you are not writing multiple points of view, that's a little bit trickier too. Number 3 is to create a set piece. A set piece, the easiest way to think of this would be the Battle of Waterloo, where you have the English forces and the French forces each pushing their army units into position for what is going to be a great big battle. Now, if you are a French soldier, if you're Napoleon, and you are moving your artillery here, and you're moving your cavalry here, and you're moving your infantry here, you have no idea how this is going to play out. But you do know there's going to be a major battle, and you can start to see that it's going to come at Waterloo or in Gettysburg as another example of a great big military set piece where the two sides were pushing their pieces together. Now, this is obviously, if you had a fantasy novel, you could literally use a battle and have a battle that's going to play out. But it could be anything from a domestic conflict where we know these two characters have been separated and they're going into counseling and they're both furious and they're going to have it out in this counseling session. That's a set piece because the reader can see it coming from a mile away. We know there's going to be fireworks when it comes. Number 4 would be to make sure that things are going wrong at all times. If a character is achieving some goal that's very important to him or her in the book, things should immediately be going wrong in that situation, unless you're really towards the end of the book and all that's left is the denouement. So a character attempts something, and whatever that character attempts is either going to fail and make things worse, or is going to be a yes, but. Yes, but she got the key, she went, the lock at work has been changed and she can't get in to get whatever she needs to get. That sort of thing. Things go wrong. That is one of the essential elements of fiction. If things are going right, then you've got kind of a problem. And think of this as a little bit like a series of obstacles that your character, who is hopefully going to be proactively trying to resolve them, is trying to overcome. Number 5 would be to put in opposition from semi-sympathetic or allied characters. We're just trying to create a little bit more tension here. So your main character has a friend who's a sidekick and he's trying to help with something, but while he has the same overall goals as your main character, has a different way of wanting to accomplish that goal. So when you have your scene with dialogue, these two characters who are allied together are going to be somewhat in conflict. If you have someone whose role it is just as a yes man for your main character and who's just a spear carrier, they're not really a character that belongs in this particular story in anything other than just a subsidiary role. If it's a friend or an ally, they need to be providing their own opposition, and that is a little bit almost like having their own plot that is creating some issues for your main character. Number 6 goes back a little bit to the having things go wrong, and that is whenever you feel some tension beginning to wane in your story, then think about trying to get your character up a tree and then throwing rocks at her, right? Chase her up that tree. Think of that scene from The Hobbit where Gandalf and the dwarves and Bilbo come out of the mines. They're being chased by the goblins riding wolves, and they flee up into the trees where the wolves can't get them. It's just not good enough at that point, and so they start putting fire up into the trees or setting fire to the trees, and that's about exactly what happens. So out of the frying pan into the fire. If your character's ever things are going too well, just find a way to start chucking rocks at them and make sure that things are getting worse, whatever the situation is. 7, this is critical. When you have a scene that has its most dramatic moments, you need to slow down the pacing. It sounds a little bit odd, maybe a little bit ironic. You have a gunfight. How long does a gunfight last, right? It could last, usually they're going to just last seconds. People are going to a few bullets are going to fly and that's going to be it. But if you're writing a scene that's the shootout at the OK Corral, should that just last for a paragraph? Of course not. You need to have that whole scene, every moment that's tense, you need to just milk that as long as possible. Those are the places where people are not going to be able to put down the book. Your time in your book has very little to do with the amount of time that you spend on a scene in your book has very little to do with the amount of time that takes place during that scene. So you could have a month go by and summarize it with a sentence or two. Throughout the course of the summer, he worked on his skills as a master swordsman, for example. If there's no plot or tension there, and you're just trying to get to that point at the end where there's going to be the big duel, then you're going to summarize all the boring parts and just kind of glide right past them into the part which is the sword fight, which may last 5 pages, but could be 30 pages of your book. So the higher the tension, the more time you have to really pull that out and stretch that out. And I'm not saying to do it in a ridiculous way, but in general, as you work through your book, find the places that are high tension, stretch that out. That could be a highly tense piece of dialogue. That could be a physical conflict. That could be a super awkward situation. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a scene. It could be a sequel type structure where you're describing an incident of extreme bullying that causes a lot of tension. But whatever that is, if it's got a lot of tension, write it slowly. And if it has very little tension, you just, if you can cut it entirely, that's even better. But if it's necessary, you still want to get through that as quickly as possible and get the information out. In scenes of maximum tension, ironically, you have more time to have characters sit and reflect on things and pull back just a little bit to go through things. I would recommend reading Stephen King. He's kind of a master at that. Whenever there's a scene where you are desperate as the reader to know what happens next, he just milks the heck out of that and draws out that tension as much as possible. I'm not saying you want to necessarily copy that method exactly, but if you want to know someone who's great at tension, I would look at Stephen King, especially some of his earlier works, among others. Find people whose books that you have a hard time putting down, and when you read them, I think you're going to find that this is pretty common. Anyway, those are 7 techniques that may or may not work for you. They're not going to be useful in every situation, but it can be really helpful when you look at points of your book where the tension is flagging, where a whole section of chapters seems to be just kind of sagging, and you had to fight your way through to write it. Not only if you have to fight your way through to write it because it's not holding your interest, it's not going to hold the reader's interest either. And you might possibly look at those 7 techniques and see if any of them might apply to your exact situation.